Okay, welcome everybody to the IHR Digital History Seminar. My name's James Baker. I'm one of the conveners of the seminar, and it's our pleasure today to welcome both Ruth and Sebastian Arnott for the Deswarte Prize seminar. Before we get going in earnest, I do some preamble stuff. The first thing to say is that we are recording today, and we will be uploading this to YouTube after the event as we normally do. So if that changes the way you ask questions, then it might do. Um, and as we go through today, please do feel free to use the chat within Zoom or to put your hand up towards the end if you have questions you want to ask. So today we are here to celebrate Ruth and Sebastian for their winning entry to the 2024 Richard Deswarte Prize in Digital History. As some of you know, including those involved in the prize itself, the prize was established in 2021 in the name of Richard Deswarte, who was one of the founding conveners of the IHR Digital History Seminar, an advocate for the value and importance of digital history, and an irreplaceable member of our community of digital historians in the UK and beyond. This now annual prize, established in his memory, tries to celebrate, I guess, the best of digital history internationally. And for those of you who are thinking, oh, I know something really great I could nominate for that prize, or work that you produced you could nominate for that prize, I'll just put in the chat the fact that the nominations are still open for the 2025 entry. They'll be open until the end of the month. So you have the time and inclination to nominate your work or some work that you love, then please take a look. So back to the third year of the prize, the 2024 prize, we had a plethora of wonderful entries to choose from. And as a group of judges, we actually commended a couple of entries alongside our winning entry. Those commended entries included the book Ordinary Lives, Recovering Deaf Social History Through the American Census by R.A.R. Edwards and Eric C. Nystrom, which we saw as a kind of really striking example of historical research that uses computational methods and a kind of careful assembly of archival material to tell stories of people at the margins, in this case, about deaf people in the United States. We also commended the article The Living Machine, a computational approach to the 19th century language of technology, which was co-authored by Daniel Wilson, Mario Nicole Arduini, Caspar Beelan, Barbara McGillivray, and Ruth Ahnert, which we commended in particular for their kind of innovative methodological contributions and a kind of exemplary approach to authorship attribution. And anyone interested in that latter point, just go look at the way in which the article describes the roles of people in it, which I think is an exemplary example of how we do collaborative work. But it was Ruth and Sebastian's monograph, Tudor Networks of Power, that took the prize, and indeed was the first monograph to do so. Peter Webster, the chair of our judging panel, remarked that, quote, the winning entry particularly impressed the judges with its deft interweaving of historical argument and methodological description. It balanced a weighty contribution to the literature on Tudor government with a generous invitation to further scholarship by others in a multitude of areas. As in previous years, the entry demonstrated the breadth, depth, and vitality of digital history today, and Richard would, Peter said, he's sure, have once again been delighted to see it. The variety, that is. So on to Ruth and Sebastian. Many of you will be very aware of their work, but I think it's always nice to remind people of who people are. Ruth, of course, is Professor of Literary History and Digital Humanities at Queen Mary University of London, is an expert on Tudor culture, book history, works in digital humanities, and was until recently the principal investigator of Living with Machines, which was a major collaboration between the British Library and the Alan Turing Institute that came to a close a little while ago. Sebastian is Associate Professor at Cambridge in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology, and is a scholar kind of noted for his interest in developing methods for network analysis in interdisciplinary contexts. Today, Ruth and Sebastian will speak to us for roughly half an hour. My understanding is the topic will be their kind of, to some extent, a history of their kind of long collaboration together, and the ways we can build on the kind of work they've done and the data sets they've produced. So I'll hand over to Ruth and Sebastian for them to give us a flavour of that work.
Thanks so much, James. And we just want to say again how honoured we are to receive the Deswarte Prize, not least because of the kind of a long journey that this publication took, probably almost a decade's work on and off. And at James's suggestion, as I said, we've decided to speak about the longer history of the project beyond those 10 years, how it arose and where it might go in the future. So let's go back to the beginning of the story.
Yes, and so I've been working in network science and complexity studies for about 20 years now, and I published on a sort of wide variety of network methods and data sets. One sort of more unusual data set I worked on was this one you can see here, which is a network of food ingredients and the aroma compounds they share, and so you can say certain things about culinary culture as a result of that. And actually, this network is also relevant in some ways to our collaboration because this arose from a visiting position I had in Boston in the group of Laszlo Barabasi in 2008. And Ruth came out to the US at the time, and she was finishing up her PhD and became interested in networks because I was working on networks, and the leader of this group had written a popular introduction to network science. And you picked it up and had a read, and then realized that actually this was highly relevant to the research that you were doing at the time.
Yeah, so if you can actually see the sort of influence of those months where I was reading this book in my PhD thesis. So I was working on the final chapter of the thesis, and I ended up using networks as a kind of conceptual framework for that chapter, which was on prison communities and actually appeared as chapter 4 in the book that came out of that work. I'd actually wanted to do like a proper experiment with networks as a methodology in the thesis, but my supervisor talked me out of embarking on something so new when I was a few months away from submitting. So I kind of had unfinished business, it felt like. And at that point in 2009, I was completely unfamiliar with the fact that there was even a field called digital humanities. I just knew that there was an idea I had that I wanted to test to see whether the kind of methodologies that Seb was using over in physics had any use for the study of archival collections.
So eventually we found some time to work on this together. So in 2011, we chose to look at a body of letters that Ruth had worked on for her thesis, which are a body of 300, just under 300 letters associated with the Marian martyrs, the Protestants who were persecuted by Mary I. These letters are only available in manuscript form. They're not digitized, and in the Manual College Library and the British Library. And our analysis of these letters allowed us to understand the persecution of this community and how they sort of kept going under these difficult circumstances. And we could also look at how it evolved as key leaders were executed. And the figure you see here is actually an example of John Bradford, who's a big hub in the network being removed. And then we study how the network still actually holds together remarkably well. That was one of the findings we looked at. Another one was to identify sustainers of the community, which turned out to often be women, in fact.
So we were really buoyed by the kind of success of like trying out this methodology. We thought, like, how can we go bigger? What should we do next? And we kind of landed on the idea of working with the state papers, and we were able to access the XML and scans of the Tudor state papers through Sebastian's university subscription. So they sent us it all on 2 hard drives. And we thought, let's get going. And our experience at that point was, oh, this is really different. So not only was the data lots bigger, so it's 130,000 letters, 20,000 people spread across Europe and beyond. We were working with someone else's data structures and all of the history that goes with that. And we realized it wasn't research ready, and it needed considerable cleaning and pre-processing. And very quickly we realized that we were going to get nowhere unless we got some funding to actually spend the time to do that proper foundational work. So I was really lucky that I managed to secure an AHRC fellowship and a Stanford Humanities Center fellowship, which then coincided with a year of Sebastian's sabbatical. So we could really focus on this. We also got a little bit of extra money to fund 4 months of extra data checking from Lotta Fickers and Josie Cree, pictured here. But it allowed us to really launch this project. And so we want to kind of focus on the data that came out of this and what was kind of leveraged by that. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit now.
So the data that the final data set is deposited, as you probably know, but just in case you don't, there's it's on the Apollo repository in which is the University of Cambridge's data repository, and it's freely available. It's a very straightforward plain text table format, so it's very easy to read, and we've got documentation to tell you what's in the data set and how to cite it. So yeah, so it's very straightforward to get hold of it. And sort of that, and in some ways we believe that this is maybe the most important legacy of the project, because you could imagine this data being used for a very long time and in many different ways. So we're really hoping that that will be taken up.
And we also wanted to ensure that for those who are interested in the data, such as Tudor historians and historians of statecraft, but might be unable to manipulate the data in those tables, could also benefit from our data cleaning efforts. So we worked with the knowledge designer Kim Albrecht on this interactive data visualization. So users can navigate all of the letters between the 20,000 people in our data set, which visualizes their correspondence either spatially, so showing the spread of places from which they wrote and received letters, and temporally, showing all the people who a given person corresponded with over time, with the ability to navigate right down to the individual letter description. So it's a really useful tool for exploration for those with even the most rudimentary digital skills.
And then, of course, this is the book itself. And we, in some ways, we would like to think of the book as actually a companion to the data rather than vice versa, which is maybe how one would more naturally think of it. Because we thought of sort of, we were trying to present basically a series of experiments of increasing methodological complexity as sort of showcasing the possible uses of the data and giving maybe some ideas for how to use this data further. Because in fact, you could spend, we could probably take each of these chapters and write an entire book on that particular method. And so that what we start off with is using sort of off-the-shelf algorithms and combinations of off-the-shelf algorithms to understand what is the shape of the archive, what are the sort of dominant, obvious hubs in the network, and what are maybe the crucial information brokers between different communities. You can do all that with fairly standard network metrics. But then we sort of progress to more bespoke methods, which we design and that's basically because we started formulating historical research questions after seeing these getting these first impressions of the data, and we then encoded those historical research questions in more sophisticated algorithmic form, so we could then layer up different methods, and we could also then incorporate text analysis as well, and combine text and network analysis, and also geospatial analysis as well. And so each chapter gives some insight on what can be done with these methods, but as I said, you could expand each of those chapters into a book or research project. So really, that's what I meant when I said it's really it's accompanying the data, it's showcasing the data.
And so just, in this talk, we want to suggest a few avenues now that we think would be really fruitful for others to take up, or maybe one day we might get the chance to take up. And some of them are suggested in the book, and some of them are more ambitious and speculative that have kind of occurred to us since writing the book. So the first area that we think is ripe for further work is the geospatial dimension. Again, one chapter, but it felt like you could go in 3,000 different directions from what we saw there. So you can see here from the geo view of the visualization that Kim developed, a view of Erasmus's correspondence. And you can see that by time ordering the places from which he wrote, we can infer an approximate and partial itinerary. It's not all of his itinerary, but it gives us some sense of his movements. Here's another one for the Secretary of State and diplomat, Sir Thomas Smith. It can you can see like the complexity that you can draw from this. We found out who travelled the longest journeys, which showed us that the government was receiving and intercepting letters from places as far away as Manila, Aleppo, Moscow, Havana, Goa, and the Azores. But once you have the itinerary of each individual person, you can start to ask your data even more interesting questions.
So you can ask who was in the same place at the same time, and we can ask this very systematically across all of these letters, so we can really find a lot of we have a lot of data to answer that question. So let's look at an example. If we have two correspondents who travel over time to different places, and these are the dates on which they write letters, and so we have one place in the middle where the red correspondent and the blue correspondent overlap on the 22nd of April, and we know that because red wrote a letter on that date and blue wrote a letter before and after that date. So from that we sort of infer that it is likely they were in the same place at the same time, at least on the 22nd of April. And so that is an overlap that we can sort of sift out of the data, and we can do that, as I said, systematically across these 130,000 letters. Now, that in itself, of course, isn't enough, because knowing that two people were in London at the same time is relatively useless. So given we can incorporate the size of the place they are meeting in, or rather the volume of correspondence from that place, and we can calculate a statistical estimate of the likelihood that these two people were in the same place by chance. And then we can focus on the most unlikely intersections, which may be the most historically significant. So we can then rank all these thousands of intersections. Yeah.
So what we found was when we ranked all of these intersections from the most unlikely, we found that at the top of those results, we were finding people in very strange places like Welsh villages, encampments outside small French towns. And we could often see that these people were meeting because they were there for the same reason. So at the top of that rank list, we see lots of examples of people brought together by wars and sieges. And we also find several people in very small towns and villages across the British Isles brought together because they were part of the people evaluating abbeys as part of the dissolution of the monasteries. And it allowed us to reconstruct narratives of why people were in unlikely places at the same time. And one nice little case study that I like to mention is, and that we talk about in the book, is the two intersections of Seth Cox and Christopher Perkins. They intersected in Prague and Krakow in the first half of the 1590s. And they're not there by accident. People are very rarely in these places together. Now, Perkins is a well-known figure. He was a diplomat and he was there on official embassy. And at first, I thought that Cox might be his servant, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Cox is a figure about whom almost nothing is known. And even if you look at the Cox family history, the only thing that you can find out about him is that he died fighting in the Irish Wars in 1599. But by reading his letters very carefully, we can infer that very likely he was an agent working for the government, sent to verify official diplomatic reports. So on both occasions that he's writing, he writes very scathing reports of Christopher Perkins. Perkins is writing back saying how well negotiations have gone, and Cox's evaluations are much more scathing about the cold reception that he received. And this is very useful. It shows us that the method can provide us with alternative accounts of events, which is not only useful for Tudor governments to know what's happening out there, but also for historians to see if there are multiple versions of events taking place, or multiple perspectives on an event. So I think there's at least two ways in which this work could be taken further. Firstly, we've only scratched the surface of the interesting itineraries identified in the Tudor State Papers. So I think there's like the easy way that, even the most basic use could be that historians want to verify whether an account that they have has verifying or conflicting accounts. They can cross-check to see if there are other intersecting itineraries and whether people are writing about this or even in passing to gather that additional data. But I think there's room for a much more systematic analysis of the intersection data, likely to cover both further case studies and also patterns of mobility. So we could tell lots more stories about individuals who are in the same place at the same time, but we could also step back and look at, are there patterns of intersection? Are there patterns of mobility that we can derive from this information? So I think there's a much more sort of data science approach. What are the patterns of intelligence's mobility or diplomats' mobility or travellers' mobility in this period? And of course, people can apply these methods to other letter archives, such as the Stuart State Papers, to EMLO, the Electronic Enlightenment, and all the various lovely European letter collections.
Yeah, and so another experiment we conducted was what we called the find similar function, which is sort of almost a bit like a recommendation algorithm that you might see on Amazon. So this here is actually Ruth's recommended book purchase on Amazon, and from that you can see that she might like a book about Mediterranean cooking, Tudor history, and assassination and violence, and that's probably quite accurate. But sort of based on this idea, we were thinking, can we somehow so what this algorithm is doing, of course, it's looking at her purchases and recommending something similar. So can we look at individuals in a network and their roles, and then maybe find other individuals that might fulfill a similar role? So we're looking for something that looks at the similarity of people in terms of their network profile in an algorithmic way. And so what we devised was an algorithm that does exactly that. So what you see here is a snapshot from our network exploration interface that we built. And the columns of this table show lots of network metrics. And what you see, the rows are people. So, and here these people have been sorted by their similarity to the person in row 1. And you can sort of see that the shades of gray indicate higher or lower values. And so you can see that the pattern of gray in each row is very similar. That's because they have a very similar relative network profile. And the person at the top is Pietro Bizzarri. So we're ranking everyone by the similarity to this person, who was a historian who traveled from England to the continent to oversee the publication of his writings, but then also took advantage of his travel to send home hundreds of intelligence reports to the government, for which he received a pension. And so who are these people who are most similar to him?
So we see some patterns. In the top 15, we find a bunch of military leaders that we see pointed out in red there. And we see men who were servants to diplomats. But the remaining 7 people in the list are fairly heterogeneous. We've got agents, priests, and merchants. And we wanted to know, do these different people, these with very different jobs, have anything in common? So an excavation of the contents and material form of these letters show us that 14 out of the 15 most similar figures to Bizzarri also sent regular intelligence reports to the Tudor government, including Palmer, who was a priest writing from Spain on Spanish affairs, Lee, who was an agent in Antwerp. It seems first to have been posted in a military capacity, but then was sending reports on the Catholic exiles. And then 2 merchants, Stallinge and Stokes, who clearly used their position at ports to pass on news items that arrived with ships. So close reading of these allowed us to see that despite very different professions, these men fulfilled similar functions for the government. And we found that find similar function was useful in this way of helping us to find all sorts of latent similarities between the people in this archive. And so how can we build on this? So I think this method is one of the most fun for others to pick up because it can be used to pursue creative and hard to spot patterns. It does require good knowledge of your data and detective skills on the part of the user to understand what the latent similarities are. So all it's telling us is like a structural similarity. Where are they deriving from and what might it tell us? Speaking broadly, this method allows researchers to pursue sort of meso-level analysis between the distant and the close, so spotting commonalities and how they might shift over time. such, for example, as the changing face of diplomacy as it professionalized over the course of the 16th century. So it allows you to better characterize heterogeneous groups, such as the intelligence producers I was just talking about. Sherman wrote about those, and it's a profession that included scholars, secretaries, clerks, merchants, lawyers, architects, surveyors, military men, and ecclesiastical leaders. And so it helps us to think about categories that might be latent or counterintuitive, such as the subjects of interception. People whose letters are intercepted might have nothing else in common apart from being the subject of that particular strategy used by governments. And I think that thinking in terms of these very latent categories can inspire new kinds of collective histories. And I hope that we might kind of inspire that kind of work if people pick up this method.
And so we've just seen an example where we're employing close reading. We don't have to just rely on close reading to actually analyze the contents of the letters, because the metadata fields in the state papers online contain the calendar descriptions, which were synopses of these manuscripts compiled in the 19th century by a range of people. And so that's all in the metadata as well, and machine readable. And so we can search and process these content fields in many different ways. And one of the things we did was to extract a rank list of keywords for each calendar year. And so that is done by using an algorithm that compares the frequency of a word in a given year across to the frequency of that word across the entire period. And so we can get statistically significant words. But then, of course, there are some words that are far less interesting, for instance, King, Queen, and Majesty. So what we're really interested in then is to look at that might appear often across the entire period. What we're really interested in is the words that appear at a particular point in time. For instance, the word amado, of which you see the example here. So in 1588, unsurprisingly, that word is used disproportionately often. And I think it's used 94 times versus 6 times in 1516. So it has a noticeable jump in frequency. And by systematically looking across all the letters, we can identify these kinds of interesting profiles that point to historically significant keywords. And then
what we might call trending topics.
Yeah.
So we wondered if we could automatically identify trending topics and what we might do if we could automatically generate these lists. So we discovered that by ranking all words in terms of the greatest change over time, provided with an extremely effective method for discovering items of topical interest to the Tudor government. So we had all these sort of automatically generated graphs of their change in frequency over time. And we sort of observed them falling into 3 kinds of categories. So in the top left, this is the graph for a man called Pickering, and it's what we call the personal history. So you have graphs that capture the history of a person's life in a way, their rise and fall. The second is event-based history, which is in the bottom left corner. Here we have the word rebellion. And of course, it's kind of a very general term that occurs regularly throughout the period of 1509 to 1603. But there are some really notable peaks in 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace, in 1570, corresponding with the Rising of North, and a kind of zigzaggy high point throughout the 1590s, which is pointing to the Irish Rebellion. And then the third kind of category of graph that we notice is what we call the narrative arc. And so that bottom right graph shows the graph for the word Rome. And the graph maps very pleasingly to what we know about the relationship between England and Rome and Catholicism throughout the 16th century. So these are the kind of things that we were observing. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
So and now, well, we're not just interested in the words themselves, we're also interested in the networks that these words represent. So what we can do is we can, for a given keyword that we've identified that might correspond to a peak in usage, we can extract the network of letters that were written with this keyword. So yeah, for instance, if you actually look at the peak, which we didn't show for divorce, you see there's a clear um, increase in frequency of that word in the period 1527 to 1534, unsurprisingly, when Henry VIII was seeking to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. And so if you look at the letters written during that period that include the word divorce, you get this network. And on the left, you see Wolsey. This is the first arrow. And then the second one is Henry VIII. And in the middle, we've got Catherine of Aragon. And on the right-hand side, you have Charles V of Spain. So you can sort of really see a sort of concise snapshot of the history of this whole affair in a sense, because you see the two opposing sides and Catherine stuck in the middle. And you also see how powerful Wolsey was, that he has more connections than Henry himself. So sort of in a nutshell, it gives you a nice overview. And you can construct this kind of thing automatically for any keyword. We looked at quite a few in the book.
So how could others build on this? So we think combining text analysis and network approaches present a powerful way to understand the dissemination of information and ideas. So using our data, people could very simply trace keywords of their own interest. So we might look to projects like the TIDE project of keywords of identity, race, human mobility in early modern England and see what those kinds of keywords, how they're appearing in our data set. But we chose a different route. We chose to be guided by the data, not to kind of go in looking for what we think we might find, but see what the data shows us. And people could go in and examine the most trending words in their related topics, because there's so much more in there that we've only been able to tell the story of a few words. But people could also augment our data. Those descriptions of the contents of the letters, we've asked, the data to show itself from those, but we could go in and enhance it. We could use named entity recognition and lots of data cleaning to find references to people who then we could trace through their discussion through the letters, places mentioned in the letters, to more systematically do things like analyzing the flow of news in the early modern period. By using the geographic and temporal data that is part of our metadata, we would be able to understand the speed with which information is moving across space. So I think that's a very powerful thing and kind of begging to be done with this data set.
Another thing we're really excited about is the potential for this data to be integrated with other data sets. And we actually have done some work on this ourselves. We were co-investigators on the Networking Archive project, AHRC-funded project, and which is the outputs of which are still being produced at the moment. And this combines data from the Tudor period, so our data set, with data from the Stuart State Papers, so that's 1603 to 1714, and also early modern letters online. And this creates a vast new archive of 450,000 letters, so which includes the Tudor letters. And we are currently working on data publication for that. We've also already written research articles which appeared in a special issue of the Huntington Library Quarterly, and we're also making available the code and visualizations, as well as there's also a monograph that's being worked on and hopefully will be submitted soon. So there's a bunch of outputs coming from that. And so this is an example of how this data can be integrated with other data sets. And we'd be excited to see that happening with other people's projects as well.
But let's think about why we might want to do that. Why bring these particular letter projects together, and indeed why bring letter projects together more generally? Early modern letters online overlaps chronologically with the State Papers, Tudor and Stuart, but on the surface it's a very different kind of collection. So it's trying to capture the intellectual republic of letters, while the State Papers ostensibly, although there's things we could say about that, is a political archive. And of course, they're traditionally studied by very different groups of historians. However, what we do know is that summer correspondence do appear across both, and we suspected at the beginning of the project and found that this was more than we knew of. Now, the reason for this is that the letter, by design, is a technology of dispersal, And because of that, data is scattered everywhere, right? It needs reassembling. And that's exacerbated by the different collection policies of those hands they came into, which might split a writer's intellectual oeuvre out from their political one. And moreover, people have many sides. Their domestic life is not separate from their professional one, or at least it shouldn't be. So thereby, by exploring the overlaps between many archives and collections, we can begin to understand a more fulsome picture of the connectivity of the early modern world. And a preliminary sense of that connectivity is given here. So this network was generated by Jan Ryan, who was a postdoc on the Networking Archives project and is just a generally brilliant scholar. It's particularly powerful because it's not showing the expanded correspondence network of people, but rather a network of catalogues, collections, and archives that this work has connected. So in the visualization, two catalogues or collections are connected if they both contain correspondence involving the same person. An edge is drawn based on the number of individuals who are found in both. Now, it's unsurprising that many figures are shared between the Tudor and Stuart state papers. I don't know if you can see that there's the biggest nodes. Maybe I'll see if I can get my cursor to. No, I can't. So the many figures are shared between the Tudor and Stuart state papers. But what might be more surprising is the large number of people shared between the Stuart state papers and the Bodleian card catalogue. Now, why might that be? This is due to the data taken in from the Bodleian card catalogue by EMLO, containing so much more material that might itself be regarded as state papers. So this is a cataloguing choice. They just ended up in the Bodleian card catalogue. They probably should have been with the state papers, but they were not. So while not as weighted, there are also other connectors spanning out from the state papers and from EMLO, and from these other catalogues contained in EMLO that show that there are huge connections between the political world of the state papers and the network known as the Republic of Letters. This tells us that the study of British politics should be contextualised with a more capacious understanding of how its personnel were connected into broader intellectual networks. And we can see how this is suggestive of the bigger initiatives needed to take this work of archival connection further to challenge cultural heritage silos.
Great. So we would like to close with an open invitation, and that's to sort of reiterate to a large extent what we've said already, which is use our data, please use our code, and also we know that this is a large data set with a lot of data cleaning, but we know that there are still errors in there, or at least things that could be improved. And so we also, of course, invite people to refine both of those things, and also more importantly, perhaps to build on our analytical approaches, to develop them further, develop offshoots of them, both using the Tudor correspondence networks and of course to apply it to their own data sets. Also to integrate our data, as we've shown in the case of networking archives, with other data sets, and to grow an ever larger archive of historical correspondence. And obviously, there are many, many things that we haven't even imagined yet that might be possible with this data, and we're very excited to see what the future brings in that respect.
So thank you for listening. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was great, and it was really lovely to hear at the end that kind of open invitation to use data, because there's so much data gets published, but I'm not sure that always the invitation is there in quite that way to use it. I'll open for questions to the audience in a moment. Please either raise your virtual hand or physical hand if you want to put your camera on, or pop a question in the chat and I'll read it out. Before we move into that, I wanted to a couple of things I want to pick up on actually. So firstly, I was really interested when you mentioned about latent similarity in data and things like that, and that kind of the other section you mentioned before that about the kind of intersection of itineraries, and how that leads into questions around, say, patterns and things like that, and opening up data. And the first thing that struck me when you started talking about, people potentially being in the same place at the same time. I started thinking about heat and cold and time of year and things like that. And I'm immediately interested in, someone going off and doing some kind of, from an environmental digital history perspective, going and find a bunch of weather data and figuring out if that makes any difference, this kind of stuff.
Perkins gives a lovely account of his journey and like all of the landscape and the cold and the snow that he passed through. So yeah, it's really ripe for that.
Yeah, and I was wondering, that's one of the things I wondered as well, because you said letter writers do lots of different things, and they often do. Yeah, they talk about the weather, they talk about the conditions, right? So I did wonder whether there are hints of that kind of stuff in there. And the other thing I was thinking about was that wonderful thing you said, which was to think of the book as a companion to the data. And that's a incredibly unconventional way to think about documentation, I guess. I've now got this imagination that for you, the book is the documentation of the data set. But I also wondered if you could give us a flavor, I guess, of some of that decision-making process that went into the kind of the data cleaning that you mentioned, because I think that seems like it was a really key part of this process. And I know from the book that you do hint at some of this, but the depth of that sort of decision-making maybe is the stuff that's in the quote, the real documentation that goes with the data.
Yeah, I think it'd be, I mean, I think if we did it now, we would probably do it slightly differently. I think but it could have taken forever. If you document every single decision you're making, it's quite hard. But yeah, when we're deciding, is this John Smith the same as this John Smith, or this one's different, and what's the piece of evidence that helped us decide? We don't document every decision like that, but what we do is we have a mapping that can be unmapped.
Yeah.
So all of the original ID. So what we assign an automatic ID to every single label in the data.
Name label, yeah.
And we've written an article about this, and if people are interested. And then we went through this 1.5 year long process of going through all 37,000 labels and doing things like looking at the dates at which they were written, looking at the handwriting, looking at the biographical details to decide if this person was the same as this person. Using knowledge bases to know who was holding what post at a certain time. So, but then there are interpretative processes in there, such as we have identified a couple of extra spies who were using aliases. And in a couple of places, we were so convinced by handwriting analysis that they were the same person that we've matched them. But again, because we've got all the original labels, people can see that process of mapping, because we don't delete anyone when we match them. We just link the IDs together. But I mean, I think there are ways that, maybe now, and if we had all of the time in the world, we might document every decision so that people could unpick it in the future. But yeah, there are always levels of doing this kind of thing, aren't there? Do you want to say anything to that?
No, just I guess what Ruth was saying, that we try to keep it sort of the whole process transparent, or somewhat transparent, or reproducible, certainly in the way that we have we encode the mapping from label to name for a particular manuscript, and then one can in principle edit that and then recreate the network again, with which then changes slightly if you start merging or splitting identities. So all of those things are kept separate, so you can rerun the whole, you can rebuild the whole network with a slightly modified mapping if you wish to do that, and you can sort of edit it at that level, rather than us just making a decision and then erasing the history or the previous iteration. So yeah, we were trying to do some rudimentary versioning in a sense, which I think, as Ruth said, with 10 years on, we'd probably have a more sophisticated idea of how to do that, because we sort of made it up to some extent as we went along. But yeah, so we certainly try to keep it transparent and reversible and reproducible.
Well, I think some of the best projects make these things up as they go along, because I think one of the things we also learned from these projects is designing a way of doing something before we even work with the data probably isn't going to work either. So doing it to go along is better. You led me on to one other little question I had, actually, which was about, like, you obviously, this is an invitation to use and reuse your data. I don't know if you come across the data sheets for datasets movement. I'm sure you have. One of my favorite questions I think they have in there is asking yourself the question, your documentation of the things you don't want people to do with your data, which to me always kind of like it resonates with the notion of expertise. And you mentioned earlier that like some of your like the latent similarity stuff, some of that really did require a bit of expertise to think about the types of similarities you're finding. So are there things that now you've opened this out to people you would really kind of rather they didn't do because you need a little bit of expertise, whether that's more on the network side or whether that's more on the kind of the historical side, that you think will just be bad uses of data effectively? Is there anything that strikes you that just would just be a bad use of this, a bad conclusion you could draw based on something you know about a quirk of the data?
I don't know. I don't have any problem with any use of the data in principle, I think. But it's just that what you then, what you then do with that. If you use it in a simplistic way and then draw false conclusions from it, that's I think the problem is with the conclusions drawn, not the yeah, I mean it depends a bit what you mean by use, I guess. But yeah, you can, of course, you can I just this example springs to mind, I think, where some people analyzed some historical texts and then jumped to a conclusion about, because a certain word started appearing, they then made a great conceptual argument, and then they realized that it was only due to the change in the letter shape S, where the S used to be written differently, so that OCR didn't pick it up, and that was I mean, so you can, I don't have a problem with the use of the method as long as if you interpret it wrongly, that's a different problem, I think.
One thing we might say is when we worked with Kim Albrecht, I think at the outset, he and we thought using like traditional network force directed layouts, like, the traditional hairball approach would be the way to do our interactive visualization. And we looked at it and we're like, this reveals absolutely nothing because it's kind of collapsing this kind of complex temporal set of relationships. So you might notice that our network visualization, it doesn't look like a network visualization as traditionally done, because that was an unhelpful visual framework for analyzing it. And so we use that we made a set of visual decisions with him that were very different from what would happen if you just stuck it all in Gephi. We're not saying don't stick it in Gephi. In fact, that might, it's got lots of useful built-in algorithms, but what you might see collapses kind of temporality, and so you need to sort of think about how you tease those things apart.
Yeah, a method you might use for an email network over a month is not going to be applicable to a letter network that takes place over many decades. Yeah. There are no questions currently in the chat. Catherine has a question.
Hello. Thank you so much for what a great paper. It was really nice to see sort of insight into your research project. I'm a first year PhD, and your work has really impacted the way that I'm kind of approaching my own topic. I just wanted to ask a question about your sort of word frequency, sort of trending topics graphs. I noticed that they're searchable like by word, but I was wondering if there was a way that the data itself, like if there was a way to kind of approach the data so that it might reveal sort of interesting spikes or patterns in a way that doesn't require sort of the manual previous knowledge of certain words that might be interesting to kind of approach.
Oh, well, I mean, in fact, so the approach doesn't require any previous input. I mean, so the approach just looks for any word that is statistically unusual in terms of its frequency. So it precisely allows you to discover topics that you might not have thought of, or words, keywords.
Yeah, so we rank them by the ones with the most change over time. So we when we first developed the method, of course we went and we're like, what does it look like for Rome? What does it look like? But then we just ranked. And then, some interesting ones come. Wagons. Why is wagons important? These kinds of things. Why is burning a really important word? And so then we went in and tried to understand what was driving those. So we took the data.
And we also clustered these profiles. So we then found several words that had the same kind of temporal profile over the period. And then we realized that those were sort of forming a topic. But that all emerged from the data. So that's all data driven. So that was an attraction of the approach. Yeah.
And it's really neat, isn't it, to see like and again, it's the similarity thing. It's like, show me the most similar graph. Oh wait, most of the most similar graphs are all to do with what's happening in the Netherlands in 1578 or these kinds of things. So it's a useful way of like letting the data guide you, and not kind of going in with, you need the prior knowledge to evaluate, but also it allows you not to go in with too many prejudices. And sometimes it's a controversial thing to say in digital humanities, that some people would argue that you must go in with a really concrete question and then operationalize it, whereas we kind of went in with a kind of really like a really big rough question, and then shook the data and then refined the method, refined the question, refined the method, refined the question, and then built our argument afterwards based on what the data showed us. But the code for that chapter is in the GitHub, and yeah, we can also like share the chapter in PDF if you can't access the books.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I've got the book, but I'll definitely be looking at the GitHub. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Catherine. And it's making me think more about that kind of open invitation you had towards the end. Like, I guess you have a particular way, for example, of thinking about what I was thinking of, almost the acceleration of a word, right? Or the decline of a word. But there presumably are multiple different ways in which you could think about things like acceleration. I'm guessing also, vocabularies might appear in a kind of mutualized way across a number of people who are writing, but it might sometimes appear because certain individuals are starting to use certain vocabularies, and it might tell you something about particular bits of networks are talking using the same words, or it might be more distributed vocabulary. And they're all kind of more complex iterations of the data that you have, and you might hit a limit at some point with that because the data is not almost big enough to do that kind of work. But it's sort of there's more teasing that can be done once this data is available in this kind of form, right?
So you reminded me of something there as well. The fact that because we're working with descriptions, what we're working with are the ways in which these letters were recorded by a set of catalogers. And I think what's useful there is also one of the problems. So what's useful is because it's someone's description, it allows us to compare letters written in lots of different languages. So it allows us to bring together letters written in Spanish and letters written in English and letters written in Latin, because they are all using the same word, because the cataloger used the same word. And it's also why it's important to look at that whole topic around it, not just that specific word, but words with the same profile, because that topic is discussed through a whole lexicon. The issue is we don't have the transcriptions of the original letters, and that's a really big work that is left to be done. Like, how would these networks look different if we were working with the original language of the letters, and then dealing with all issues of like non-standardization of like English spelling in English language and working across multiple languages? It becomes in some ways much more complex to do the thing that we did, but it would also yield lots more interesting results as well. So that's another thing that is like an open invitation to do. Please, someone transcribe these letters. Like, thanks to HDR, that's now possible. But this is like another huge bit of work that would absolutely transform this metadata if it was linked to full text transcriptions, like something we couldn't dream of, but is looking more and more possible.
Yeah, and it turns what is a data set that you produce that is the data set into a data set that interacts with another data set in really interesting ways. It wouldn't. I think what's important about your work here is that you didn't go straight to the letters and try to do the transcription. I think there's an interesting lesson that kind of, for me, that resonates from your book around the default assumption that you need the most granular form of data you can find, which is the actual words on the page, may not be the data that you need to be amenable to the interesting questions you want to ask. And you did say, you iterated from the data you had and the methods you're using and the questions. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach. I think what's interesting about that is that, the questions that you seem to be asking are still quite important and profound within the field. And I haven't asked you this question yet, but, this is resonating through fields in study of the Tudor world, right? It's not just people who are, interested in methodological approaches who are kind of interested in this work. It is sort of resonating there as well. So there's something that you're doing, it seems, that is important to the field, without actually going into that level of doing the HDR, the transcription, all that kind of stuff, because that can be our default approach as many historians. We need to get to the letters, and if we haven't got that, we can't possibly work with them.
Yeah.
But even if you have the data, you still can't analyze it, by reading every letter. You have to also use step back as well.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah.
The proxies you have are pretty good proxies. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
We've got a question from Natalie.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Right. Right. I'm actually doing an MRes at the moment because I'm just trying to learn how to research. I've actually come to the research from genealogy, and I've created a data set of about 6,000 gun makers during the English Civil War. And I would love to be able to do something with it using social network analysis. But I'm thinking I need to use Gephi. I just wondered, I love your work because obviously it shows it's possible, but where do I start?
I think this is a really good question. I think you want to try it with something off the shelf that's really easy before you actually spend loads of time learning.
Okay.
And so I'm a really big fan of Palladio because it's like a drag and drop kind of program that's designed specifically for humanities users. And as long as you've got your data in the right format and there's loads and loads of online tutorials for this, and you can drop it in, you can immediately get results and you can like drag things around. It hasn't got any of the metrics, like the kind of betweenness or eigenvector or blah, blah, blah. But you can immediately see if your data is going to start showing you something useful. And then once you know it is, then it's worth learning the additional, harder to learn tools or even a bit.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, but
what about there's also that thing that John
Ladd is called Network Navigator. So it's similar. They were thinking of sticking Palladio together with Network Navigator.
That's a little bit more metric, but it's also very easy to use.
Precisely. Actually, he was inspired by our interface. And so it's basically the same principle as Palladio. It's a drag and drop process, but it runs about 5 different metrics automatically on everything. So it's a really good, we used to do a bunch of workshops, and you can have people up and running with Palladio and Network Navigator inside 2 hours.
In minutes, I would say. Well,
no, you need everyone to have their
but
we
had a 2-hour
tutorial. And by the end, people had visualizations they were working with. So it's really
okay. That's great.
Really doable.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, James, for popping those in the chat. And if you just Google tutorials, there's loads of tutorials online for the Palladio. And I don't know about Network Navigator, but we use it in our teaching. It's because it's so great.
Thank you for the question and thank you for the answers. And yeah, it's often something we often get asked at these seminars. It's like, where do you get going with these methods? And I guess it's an interesting question in the context of your work because you work in collaboration as well. And many of us in the humanities will by default work on our own and work through our methods and develop them ourselves. But you, both in this work, but in other work, of course, you've been doing, Ruth, have been kind of showing the ways in which collaboration does enable the sort of the development of the research we're trying to achieve in the humanities. I mean, I often, it's a bit of a silly one, but I often say, I will try anything until I run out of talent. And when I run out of talent, I find a collaborator. And that is not always possible when you're writing a PhD or when you're an MRes student. But at some point, this kind of work does require some kind of collaborative thinking, collaborative working. So I hope you find what you need, Natalie. But if you can't quite figure things out and you need someone else who can kind of bring some expertise, then you can find those communities and to do that kind of work. And hopefully, this seminar, other versions of this seminar, the authors themselves, people like, John Ladd, are the kind of people who are very open to someone pinging them an email and saying, I'm trying to use your Network Navigator tool. I'm not sure what this does. Can you tell me? And I'm sure someone like John will kind of help you out. So the community out there tends to be quite nice and friendly, I find.
Yeah. You're so right about that. What the nice thing about collaborating is when you think you've come to a dead end, we had this during the book. I'd be like, I've come to a dead end. This isn't showing me anything. And then you would sit down and go like, but what about this? Oh, and sometimes it just unblocks you and you realize you've got something without knowing it, that someone from a different discipline can see that you can't. And I really think that that's what's wonderful about collaboration, that you can kind of rest on the things that you're good at and then come together and learn things that are new.
And I think with something we didn't really talk about today, but which is really important, is the sort of iterative idea that we, you iterate when you're developing these ideas. You you sort of you start with this broad question. I mean, you touched on it a bit. You start a broader question, and then you try and look into the data, and then you realize that you have to reformulate your research question and also your algorithm sort of in concert. And you sort of encode your historical question as an algorithm essentially. But you have to do that. You have to sort of iteratively understand both sides. So I think that's how the collaboration works best. If you build that algorithmic and historical understanding together of a particular question.
And then you learn what I know way more about network algorithms than I ever thought I would. And you know way more about Protestant women than you ever thought. Oh, you would.
Yeah, and Tudor history. Yeah.
So there are no more questions in the chat, and there's no more hands at the moment. I'll ask a final question then, which is very much the question that Richard would often ask at the end of seminars, which will then probably open out into a longer discussion. It's the kind of the what's next question, but actually this is a kind of a different version of the what's next question, I think, because you've told us a lot about what you want us to do next, or what you want the community to do next. But I guess my question then is, what bits of this are you thinking of sort of taking on, or is this one of those moments where you're going, you know what, we've done enough with this, we're going to move on to something else? Where does the kind of your work together go from here?
We were just saying this morning that we'd like to work together again because we really, really enjoy it. And there is that, some of the things that we gave previews of are stuff that we've worked funding bids up on that might have not been successful yet. So I think thinking about the dissemination of news, like thinking about that kind of geospatial and temporal view on how ideas are disseminated, how news, we'd love to work on that. I'd love to write a kind of collective biography of those intelligences. But it's always subject to time, funding, slotting it between other projects. So yeah.
Yeah, we definitely, I mean, the sort of the named entity recognition, systematically extracting, who was talked about. We did a case study on, one individual that was talked about, and then you can look at the network of people, and then they're sort of exiled and then reintegrated. So you could to do that on a systematic scale to trace, how people, who's talked about. The same with the Marian martyrs. The people who appear. If you look at the actual letter contents, you see a lot of people mentioned who never write letters, but who actually turn out to be key figures in the network if you include them in the social network rather than just the letter network. So, so to do that systematically would be really nice, but that would require quite a lot of work and a grant with a couple of postdocs or something like that. So yeah, we are definitely thinking about those kind of follow-up projects. Yeah, it's about finding the time and the resources.
Precisely. That's the problem that every person in this room is probably having with
time and resources.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, in that case, thank you so much. We'll leave it there. Congratulations again on the prize. I'm pretty sure you got your certificate in the post, and I hope it's somewhere on a wall. Excellent. Thank you so much for giving us an insight today into your working process, where this all came from, because I think that those stories are really valuable to be told, because I think it does go into some of the questions today, really help the community understand how research comes together, and then it doesn't sort of come together by magic. It does come together through various bits of iteration and failure and trying things, and then having some successes and moving from there. And thank you for giving us a kind of a set of pathways to move forward with. I'm looking ahead towards, programs I might be running and modules I might be running, and thinking, well, to some extent, I might be able to just point a few people at this video once it's on YouTube and say, here's some ideas of what you could do with data of that form if you want to work on network analysis. So that might be something that you start finding that students maybe at my institution or other institutions start working on over the next few years alongside you. So thank you so much. Thank you to all the audience for being here today and for your questions. Before we let Ruth and Sebastian go, I just want to let those here know that we have a seminar next week on the 27th of May, where Amanda Regan from Clemson University will be joining us to talk about mapping the gay guides, using digital history to explore LGBTQ travel guides between 1965 and 2005. So we're moving after a bit of a run of early modern and medieval work onto something more contemporary, but I'm sure many of you will join us for that. But all it leaves to say then is thank you so much again to Ruth and Seb for a wonderful seminar. and hopefully we'll see you again at the seminar soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
All
for
right.
your time.
Bye-bye.